Thank you, Ikokawa-san. I appreciate the opportunity to give you a brief perspective on theme 1 of ASM3, Observe. This represents work by my fellow Science Advisory Board members, and I'd also like to acknowledge the ASM3 organizing team and Jenny Baseman. If I could have the next slide, please. In terms of the relevancy and urgency of sustained observations of Arctic change, 2 recent reports that came out since the last Arctic Science Ministerial by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change are particularly relevant. You see a summary figure here from the special report on the oceans and the cryosphere that had an Arctic section and highlights the importance of observations that are critical in terms of addressing some of the hazards and risks associated with warming in the Arctic. The IPCC highlights and summarizes findings that the 1.5 degrees centigrade global warming, which will be amplified by a factor of 2 to 3 or more in the Arctic, will be associated with severe and widespread impacts, including irreversible and persistent climate-related hazards. And of course, as you're aware, many of these have global repercussions, but also, as you see highlighted in the figure on the right, greatly impact the livelihoods of the indigenous peoples of the Arctic. Observations are critical in this context, both to identify and track hazards, to inform different options on responses, and more broadly, to underpin the support of livelihoods and the health of Arctic and global systems. The next slide, please. The Arctic Science Ministerial itself is highly relevant and represents the urgency of some of the actions that previous speakers have already alluded to. We find that the speed of change is challenging conventional response mechanisms, both on the research side, but also in terms of the government's mechanisms that allow us to respond to some of these challenges and opportunities. At the same time, the urgency that has been highlighted and emphasized by Arctic indigenous peoples taxes communities and calls for additional capacity building that the ASM3 is very timely in addressing. As you're well aware, transboundary and global impacts require internationally collaborative approaches that focus on shared benefits, and the approach of the third Arctic Science Ministerial to recognize that iterative and rapidly adaptive approaches are needed is highly commendable, as we're seeing the feeding of observations into improved understanding, formulation and execution of response actions, and an overall strengthening, which in turn then leads to further more focused and more beneficial observations. The next slide gives you a brief perspective on some of the progress made since the second Arctic Science Ministerial. I'd like to highlight the 3 top categories of advances. You're well aware and have already heard from previous speakers about some of the inventories that have been underway. Several countries and broader international efforts in various parts of the Arctic have been conducting sustained observations of a rapidly changing Arctic. And many of these, in particular through the push that the second Arctic Science Ministerial has provided, have focused very much on the societal benefits and the value that observations provide in a broader international context. The challenge that we're facing is how to allow individual scientists, many of the researchers or research teams that are represented in the observations and projects submitted to the Science Ministerial, how to allow them to contribute to a broader overarching shared goal and ensure that observations are of value both at the local scale, driven ideally by local information needs and local guidance, including indigenous peoples' guidance on high priority observations, but also meeting global information and benefit needs. You see now emerging the progress that has made in terms of so-called essential variable frameworks that are informed by a lot of the prior work that is highlighted here. I'd just like to point out the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program, shown as an example here, with very specific guidance now emerging on the types of observations, which variables, where and in what form, what are more specific requirements being slowly identified. And critical in this context is the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks Initiative under the Arctic Council and the International Arctic Science Committee, so a body that unites both Arctic and non-Arctic countries, and its roadmap for Arctic observing and data systems, which is now getting underway and providing a broader framework for different contributions to ensure the greatest value for all of those in need of and benefiting from sustained Arctic observations. The next and final slide then gives you a perspective, a bit more of a glimpse into some of the projects that have been submitted to the Arctic Science Ministerial number 3. All of these, of course, are now accessible in the database that Inamoto-san already referred to earlier. You see a range of different categories of contributions, and this is something that you can review on your own or delve into more depth if you're interested as part of the Arctic Science Ministerial webinars. But the key points to highlight here are that we're seeing an increasing affiliation or association of observations with existing networks and existing frameworks that allows direct contribution and benefits to an overarching larger whole. We're also seeing ready access to data increasing, but more work is needed as a more detailed analysis of these submitted projects reveals. And finally, it's great to see 9 projects submitted here identified with Indigenous involvement or leadership, but clearly in the broader picture, still comparatively few efforts with Indigenous leadership and participation, something that the hope is that initiatives such as the Say on Roads process will help alleviate in the future. I appreciate the opportunity for this overview, and I hand it back to the session moderator. Thank you.